really came in to hear George. So I'm going to make a quick introduction. I'll tell you that when we started to look for what this topic might be, for some reason we had epoxy on the mind. And we reached out to a lot of different people, but it just so happened that we ended up with talking to George, and he was writing a book on the topic, not just epoxy, but epoxy for woodworking. And his philosophy is going to be consistent with ours, which is it is something you include in a woodworking project. He said to me, I've never done a river pour, and I probably never will. I use epoxy in a whole lot of different ways. So he is educated for 35 years, which means he started at age 10, apparently. He is the voice and the talent behind the Woodworkers Guild of America. He has a school that he teaches at. He runs around the country talking at shows, etc. And we're just very fortunate to, for a second time in a little over a year, have George Von Driska. George, welcome. Thank you for being with us. And folks, will have a Q&A towards the end, but right now the floor is George's. Thank you, George.
Hey, well, thanks very much to everyone for having me for this. What?
Don't worry about that. That was, we need to get Jim's muted again.
Okay. So thanks very much. And I was thinking about this because it was, what got me to San Diego was when my son graduated from the Marine Corps base out there. And then I actually got to be in your shop that time. I think that was our first go around. And then we did the CNC thing. And then here we are doing this again. My daughter, Ginny, is behind the scenes over here running the camera. If you've seen videos of mine, you've probably seen Ginny in some of those videos. She worked for me here in the shop for quite a while. So like Travis said, my deal with epoxy is I treat it very much the same way as choosing a finish, choosing a stain. So I don't, with some exceptions, I don't see it as a thing unto itself. I see it as a way to augment artwork or woodworking. Ginny is very artistic, me not so much. So epoxy is a bit of a cheat that I can use to add a little pizzazz to stuff. One of the things I'm going to do, and you have to just trust me on this, I'm going to mix these two things. And the reason I'm mixing them is jumping ahead a little bit, but there's a timeliness to them being mixed. And this is all going to make great sense. It's a little bit of mad science. It will in fact make sense as we go. While I'm mixing, I'll talk a little bit. What we'll do tonight is give you an overview of epoxy and how I see it getting used in a woodworking shop. This isn't going to be a comprehensive across the board, every nut and every bolt as it relates to epoxy, but a functional knowledge of, if you want to work with this stuff, what is it you need to know? What do you need to be cognizant of? And we've got some products on the table here that we can talk about. And then I've got a number of JPEGs we can go through. Some of those are process shots. Some of those are techniques related to working with epoxy. And then also some projects I've completed that incorporated epoxy in a bunch of different ways, so that you can maybe get some ideas from that about how you may or may not want to include it in your woodworking. While I'm doing this, let's talk about a really important thing, which is the environment in which you're going to work with epoxy. Epoxy wants to be warm. And by warm, in this part of the world where 6 weeks ago, the air temperature was 20 below, that means you really need to have the furnace on. Epoxy wants it to be 68 to 72 degrees in your shop. One of the things that I will probably say about 400 times tonight is read the instructions. So when I give a parameter like 68 to 72 degrees, different manufacturers are going to have different numbers. And I can't say enough how crazy important it is to read the instructions that come with the epoxy you choose to use to make sure that you're using it correctly. So again, you know, you might see a video, you might see this class tonight. You really need to drill down in detail on the particular product you're buying to make sure you're using it right. In regard to temperature, if the product got delivered to your place yesterday by UPS and it sat outside where it's 60 degrees overnight, even if your shop is warm, you can't bring that epoxy in and expect to use it. In addition to your environment being warm, the epoxy itself needs to be at that temperature. And I can give you an example. Just about a week ago, a friend of mine did a tabletop pour on a beautiful walnut table, and he did it here, and I had jacked up the temperature in the shop knowing he was coming, but he walked in the door with the epoxy, and I was working on this end, he was on that end. He mixed it up, and once he started to pour it, it was really, really, really cloudy, and it should have been perfectly clear, water clear. So the more we talked about it, and I mean, basically all I had to do was this, which was touch the bottle of epoxy. He'd had it in a building at his place where it sat on the floor, and that epoxy was probably, maybe it was 60 degrees. And one of the side effects of that is it's not going to flow out. The cloudiness is a side effect of that. So in the end, probably nearly $100 worth of epoxy got poured onto his tabletop. And eventually we had to just take squeegees and pull it off because it was not going to go well. So that really just came down to, in his case, not following the directions and not having that epoxy acclimated to a warm environment before he chose to do the pour. What I'm doing here is I'm mixing a tabletop epoxy, and I very intentionally have it in a glass or in a mix cup where it's going to sit here about, I don't know, that's probably nearly 3 inches of epoxy all stacked up. So for a second now, I'm just going to put this down, and then Ginny will remind me to come back and do the science experiment part of this as we go. All right. So environment, it's got to be warm. You can't, much like finishing, you can't go from machining wood, sanding your project to then laying on epoxy. Like working with polyurethane, epoxy has a really slow cure time. So if dust mites are migrating out of the air over a long period, they're going to end up landing in the surface. It is very, very possible when you work with epoxy correctly to end up with a mirror smooth surface that doesn't need any other buffing, polishing, or treatment. That's not going to be the case if it's full of dust nibs. So the environment, in addition to being warm, needs to be as absolutely dust-free as you can make it. And that is prior to working with the epoxy, and then also while the epoxy cures out. Here on my bench, I'm sort of set up as though we might be pouring epoxy tonight. And that is, I've got a big sheet of poly, or a 6 mil poly draped over the bench. Epoxy won't stick to this. And almost invariably, when you do almost any kind of pour, you're going to have some drips and stuff that come off of your project onto something. If they come onto this plastic, once that epoxy cures out, we can peel that off and keep using the plastic over and over and over again. You definitely don't want epoxy to just simply drip onto a wooden surface because it sticks to wood. So that's going to be there forever unless you sand it off, or while it's still liquid, clean it up. Let's talk about that. Solvent for epoxy is alcohol, denatured alcohol. So you definitely want to have, from a cleanup perspective, you want to have denatured alcohol on hand. We'll talk about rubbing alcohol when we get a little further along into working with epoxy and how that fits into stuff. Reading the instructions. Okay, have I mentioned how important it is to read the instructions? You really got to read the instructions. And the reason I'm going in that direction, and it's going to get us to this mix right here, is there are different products sitting on the table here, and there are way more than 3 epoxy products in the marketplace. But these are 3 that I think you are most commonly going to come into or want to use for using epoxy the way I use it. We've got a deep pour epoxy. Jenny's going to zoom. We've got a deep pour, we've got a tabletop, and then we've got penetrating epoxy. So it's crazy critical that you choose the right product for what you're doing. Deep pours like this, and there are a number, this is MAS epoxy. There are lots and lots of brands offer this. Deep pours are what one might use if you have a big crack in a tabletop and you want to fill that crack with product. You want to fill that crack with epoxy. Deep pour, just like the name says, these are products that are generally going to be capable of pouring in 1/2 inch, 1 inch, maybe even more increments before running into trouble. Running into trouble, what does that mean? Epoxy is an exothermic reaction as it cures. So we mix a hardener with a resin, and as those chemically react with each other, exothermic, they give off heat. If we choose the wrong product, so tabletop epoxies generally are designed to be used in 1/8 inch to 1/4 inch layers on your work. So just like the name says, tabletop, this is the type of product my friend Charlie used to pour over his table. We're using it basically like a finish. We've probably all seen this very commonly in bars. Maybe there's stuff embedded in the bar top, and then they do a pour over the top of that, and it's got that really, really, it looks like uber thick polyurethane. The reason I did what I'm doing, or I did what I did here with the tabletop, is to show you what can happen if we try to make that tabletop product go in a deep pour direction. I've mixed it up according to the directions, 50-50, and we're going to come back to that whole mixing thing. And as it sits here, I have a heat sensor, gauge thing, what? Heat sensor, yeah, well, I don't know. Sorry, momentary confusion here. So I've got a heat sensor, and when I point that at that, we're at sneaking up on 71 degrees. We're going to come back and look at that. Now already we have heat because it is not 71 degrees in my shop. So we're already warming up there. The product I have on the end here, penetrating epoxy, this is used for a variety of different things. If you've got a chunk of wood where it's punky, so it's generally where wood is just getting to the point where it's getting real pretty. So it could be a piece of spalted maple that's right on the edge of, instead of being spalted, it's like ready to just turn into fungus and be dust. If you need to support that stuff so that you can actually work with it, that's what you could use penetrating epoxy for. In addition, penetrating epoxy is often used under products like tabletop or deep pour, because one of the things that happens is wood has pores in it. It's got porosity. So as we pour a liquid over the top of it and the liquid enters those pores or crevices, then bubbles want to come out. And we can deal with that to some extent, and I'll talk about that. But if we can stop it from happening, that's maybe better. So it's not uncommon that a penetrating epoxy gets applied to a surface before we do anything with epoxy, so that we don't have those bubbles to deal with, and we don't end up with bubbles that are frozen in the epoxy that we can't get out. Are you saying there's a question, Jenny? All right, fire away.
You mentioned denatured alcohol with epoxy.
Yep.
Are there substitutes for that?
So Jenny said, the question is there a substitute for denatured alcohol? Boy, not that I'm aware of. So everything I have seen to date is to use alcohol. Denatured alcohol is the solvent. But what one could do is read the directions for your particular product. So it, as you choose to go in an epoxy direction, and again, you get the info that comes with your epoxy. Somewhere in there, it's going to say clean up with, just like it does on a can of finish. And that'll tell you if there's something else you can use besides denatured alcohol. One of the things that's worth paying attention to, a visual we can get right here, is when we look at the deep pour, the resin bottle is big, the hardener bottle is little. When we look at the tabletop, the two bottles are the same size. When we look at the penetrating epoxy, two different sizes. What this tells me right away is that our mix ratio from product to product is going to be different. It might surprise you to learn, you have to read the instructions. This stuff mixes in a 3-to-1 ratio. This mixes in a 1-to-1 ratio. The penetrating, I think, is also 3-to-1, but don't hold me to that. Just because MAS and Total Boat do that doesn't mean every product does that. So it's really, really critical that we follow the instructions for this, and we get the proportion mixed correctly. A really good tip I got, Jess Crow is somebody who knows a boatload about epoxy. He's been working with it for a really long time. And in the world of mixing, a cheat that I got from her, I have music on in my shop all the time, except when I'm doing this, and is to mix for the duration of a song. So we're looking for about 3 minutes of mixing time, and that's across the board with any one of these products. You want to have approximately 3 minutes of mixing time. So mixing for that song play is a good way to do that. When it comes to mixing, you really want to be as careful about this as you possibly can. We're in high school chemistry class in order to get this right. So you don't want to just take a yogurt cup and fill it about halfway, and another yogurt cup and fill it about halfway, and figure that's giving you the 1-to-1 that you need. You really want to use a metered cup. And these are very specifically designed. I'll set it down, Jenny, so I'm not doing that bad video presenter thing. These are specifically designed to allow you the proportions you need. So it's marked right on here, 5-to-1, 4-to-1, 2-to-1, and we have to work with those numbers in order for the product to work correctly. You do, again, what a surprise, you got to read the instructions. There are epoxies out there. I'll just quit saying that because I'm probably driving you nuts. There are epoxies out there that mix according to weight rather than according to volume. And I had one here. I can't remember what brand it was, but it was a 1-gallon jug of resin, and it was a 1-gallon jug of hardener. And if you mix those by volume instead of by weight, then what the reaction there is, it actually turns foggy, it turns milky, and it's just the chemistry of it. So it's a really good thing to know, because if I'm going to choose to use that product, I have to have a scale, a balance in my shop that's fine enough that I can measure out so many grams or ounces by weight, not ounces by liquid, of product A and product B. Most epoxies mix by volume. But again, it's just an awareness thing. I find the mix by weight thing to be really, really cumbersome, and it's much easier to do your mixing in a cup like this. All right, I'm going to do a read here just so we can see if we're gaining or what we're gaining. All right, now we're at, let me get centered on it. We're currently at almost 80 degrees now on this tabletop mix. So it's climbing pretty rapidly. Again, exothermic reaction. And what's making this happen is that this is a product, tabletop, that's designed to be poured at 1/8 to 1/4 inch. If I don't read the instructions, or I choose to ignore the instructions, and I pour it like this, using it as a deep pour, it's going to give off this heat. And spoiler alert, when I've done this demo in the past, this has gone as high as 180 degrees. That ruins the epoxy. So it's not just, oh, it got hot and it's going to be okay. It got hot and it's going to ruin the pour by getting that hot. Back to the world of mixing. In a small volume, like we're talking about here, or the cup I have here, doing that with a wooden popsicle stick or paint stick, anything like that is going to be fine. If you do get into a bigger volume, then a standard rubber beater that you would use to mix paint works great for that. Put this in a cordless drill. Do not run the cordless drill as fast as it will go. You want to run it really as slow as it can go. If you run this if you run it really, really fast, you're going to introduce bubbles, and you're going to be fighting those bubbles throughout the duration of your project. So it's fine to use a beater, but you want to run it uber slowly so that we don't get air entrained epoxy out of this thing. When you buy your beater, you want it to be one that's got rubber flanges on it. And then when you're done with it, you can just allow the epoxy to cure on there. And the next time we use this, by bending it, the epoxy cracks. And that's going to cause it to just flake off of that rubber. And we'll be able to clean that all up and use it again for the next epoxy project. Um, in addition to epoxy, let's talk for just a second now about stuff we can add to epoxy, but we're going to hit this more when we get to the slides. In broad strokes, I'm just going to separate this into pigment and mica powder. Those are very commonly used. Pigment can be used to tint the epoxy, and you'll see in the slide, this will give us a color. So if I choose to use this maize yellow, I'm going to turn my epoxy that yellow. Now, the differentiation I'm going to create is when we get to mica powder. So it's very, very concentrated stuff. A drop or two of this goes a really long way. When you're using this, you want to start by adding just a very little bit, mixing, seeing what it looks like, adding a little more, adding a little more. With just a little bit in there, we might have maize yellow, but translucent maize yellow. As we add more and more, then we can get opacity. We can get it to where you cannot see through it anymore. You can mix colors. So if the color you're shooting for isn't available in your selection here, we can mix stuff up in order to get the color we want. Mica powder, lots and lots of these on Amazon. And in fact, I mean, everything I have my hands on here is available on Amazon. Mica powder is also used in makeup. And the differentiation I'll create here, and you'll see slides of this, is that here with the pigment, I get that single uniform color. Translucent or opaque, it is just yellow or just green or whatever. When I go with the mica powders, this is what gives me a pearlescence to the end result and a shimmer. And again, you'll see slides of this. We can mix the two. So if I want to use this blue shimmery mica powder, but I want it to have more depth of blue to it, I can start with a pigment, and then I can add the mica powder to get the pearlescence. It takes a lot of mica powder to get opacity. It doesn't take a lot of pigment to get opacity. So it's good there's a good marriage between the two, depending on what look it is that you're trying to end up with. So let's do this. If there are questions specific, I'm going to do another heat scan here, but I'm getting really close to where we're going to walk over and start doing the slides. So maybe if there are any specific questions, like something I need to point out while I'm standing here, I'll give you a second to come up with that, and then we'll jump on the screen share and I'll show projects. All right, at this second in time, now we've broken 80 degrees on this. So again, choosing the right material and then using it correctly. So even with the deep pour, if it says it pours to a 1/2 inch, you can only pour to a 1/2 inch. Now, a great question would be, if I've got a 2-inch thick tabletop, what do I do? And the answer to that is you'll pour in layers. So a deep pour product would be a great choice because we can do 4 layers of 1/2 inch. But the sequence of events is really, really, really important. At the end of the day, this stuff is plastic. When it's cured out, it's a piece of plastic. So when I get that first layer in, I need to get the second layer poured on top of it when the first one has got to just the right point, but not too far. So think of it like polyurethane. If I've got a coat of polyurethane down and it's fully dry and I'm going to do another coat of poly, I have to get some tooth in that first coat for the second coat to stick. Same thing here. If I do a deep pour and I give it probably a 24-hour cure time, and then I pour a layer on top of it, 1, you won't have adhesion between the layers. 2, you'll probably see a line. If there's an end where you can see into that crack, you'll probably see a seam there because one layer of epoxy is laying on top of the other. So again, the manufacturer will tell you at some point with a deep pour, probably around 12 hours in, the first one is dry enough that we can pour a second one on top of it and not have an exothermic concern but it's tacky enough that the two of them are going to bond together, and we don't have to get in there and scuff it to give it tooth to accept the second layer. So when we do those layered pours, timing is everything. Getting those layers to come in the right time frame. Ginny says we have some questions, so fire away.
First question, could you use acetone as a substitute for denatured alcohol?
I don't know. So the question was, could you use acetone as a substitute for denatured alcohol? I don't know. I wouldn't use it unless it says on there that it's okay to use it.
Next question, is there a proper temperature to pour?
Is there a proper temp to pour? So yeah, when I opened and was talking about the environment of 68 to 72 degrees, and again, it'll say like, so right on the back of this jug, it says, work in a shop with material above 75 degrees. So you're going to get that information from the manufacturer. So yeah, it needs to be whatever they're telling you it needs to do. And even with small scale tabletop stuff, you'll see some charcuterie boards I've detailed with epoxy. If you don't, even for that little project, if you have not warmed up the shop, it just doesn't flow out right. And when we're asking colors to mix in order to get the wave pattern and that kind of stuff, it just is not going to perform the way it should. All right.
They want to specify like temperature of specifically the epoxy.
Yeah. So temperature of the epoxy. So same. If that's like my friend Charlie walking into a 72 degree environment with 60 degree epoxy. And so when he poured that, it was all milky like that. And that milkiness was a result of it being too cold to pour. And that was the stuff, like I said, about $100, about $100 worth of epoxy got squeegeed off of that table. Plus, and then it's a time sink too, because now the residue that's left has to get sanded before we can do the whole thing again. And that's only because the epoxy was too cold, the epoxy itself. What some people will do with the epoxy is you can get a heating pad on Amazon for about $30 and put that on your bench under the plastic, but then let the epoxy bottle sit on top of it just at low temp. And that way you're specifically heating the bottles. I know people put them in a warm water bath as well. And that just makes me a little nervous that when I pick this up, if there's water on here and I'm about to decant that and pour, I don't want water from this to drip into the epoxy. So it's a warm water bath will work. Obviously, it warms it up. But I would be nervous about accidentally migrating water into the epoxy.
What is the range of cure times?
Range of cure times. So on this tabletop stuff, in about a day, you can touch it. But where you have maybe drips or there are drips on the bottom of your cutting board or tabletop or whatever you've done, generally it takes about 72 hours for it to be cured to a point where you can sand those drips off. On the deep pour stuff, some of those deeper casting resins and that kind of stuff are as long as a week. And if you're looking at turning, or if you're looking at casting something that you're going to turn, you really have to pay attention to that to make sure it's at full cure. And full cure is different from initial cure. So it's a little bit like a glue, right? You've got initial tack where you probably can't pull those pieces apart, but that yellow glue that's preventing you from pulling the pieces apart isn't fully cured still for, I think, 12 or 16 hours. So same with this, with the deep pour stuff, a day later, it's hard to the touch. With this particular MAS product, a day later, it's hard to the touch, but it is not fully cured at that point where you could start to machine it. Go ahead.
How do you avoid witness lines in between different pours?
How do you avoid witness lines between pours? So this goes back to that, watching the timing, paying attention to what the manufacturer tells you. There's this window of opportunity where we pour our first ½ inch with the deep pour on a 2-inch slab. So we get that first ½ inch in there, and we can't just willy-nilly do another ½ inch because then we're going to have an exothermic reaction. So that first layer is got to get to a point where basically what it comes down to is it's still it's still tacky. It's not hard to the touch. And at that point, it will accept another layer seamlessly. If you go too far and you let it cure out too much and it's hard and it's that layer of plastic, we're pouring plastic on plastic now, then you have to get in there and scuff it up, which of course inside something like a crack in a table could be, the mechanics of that could be impossible. But it's all about watching that timing so that layer number 2 is going on top of layer number 1 in the right time frame. Yes, ma'am.
You mentioned cutting boards. Is it food safe?
Great question. Mention cutting boards. Is it food safe? So there's a lot of dissension on this in the ranks among the epoxy companies. Some epoxy companies will say their particular product is food safe. Others will say there's no such thing as a food safe epoxy. And then here's another thing to consider. If I start with this product, and even if they say, even if Total Boat says this tabletop is food safe, as soon as I add pigment or mica powder or metal filings or any additive, I've changed that chemistry, and now it wouldn't be fair for me to say to Total Boat, is it still food safe? Because I've adulterated their original mix. So as a safe bet, when I'm doing something where I'm using epoxy, I leave real estate open in the form of wood, and then I've put a decoration on there in the form of epoxy. But that's not intended to be part of the food surface. It's intended to just be a decoration, and then everything else is food area. All right, covered on questions?
Hey, George.
All right, let me do one more, and which isn't to say you can't continue to ask questions. You got another one, Jenny? Are you?
I had one, George, which is, it's probably answered in the directions that you keep saying, but we focus an awful lot about the temperature of the material and the components when we do the initial mix. And yet it takes, as you say, up to 72 hours, maybe a week to get fully cured in certain circumstances. Over the course of that arc of time, does it still need to be kept at that, let's say, 68 to 72 degree temperature range? Or is it only for a certain period of time, like the first 2 hours, where that kind of temperature range is critical?
Well, I think it's more than the first 2 hours, but it's not. If it's a week to fully cure, it doesn't have to be a week. But we have to get it to that. We really have to get it to that first stage where you can touch it, and it's hard to the touch at the right temperature. So I hate doing it. I have a 3,200 square foot shop. When it's 20 below, I hate having the thermostat at 72 any longer than I have to. It's normally like 60 in here. But you need to get it through that first window of that first set. And then from there, you could go back to ambient temperature.
What's your personal rule of thumb there when you're actually doing this?
A day. A day.
Wow. Okay. Okay. And you may still cover this, but you mentioned how, for instance, when you do a pour over a surface, you'll end up with maybe some drips on the side. There will be some sanding and finishing that you need to do. What you do to the surface in order to get it to smooth again, and then how do you get it to look clear? You and I talked about this prior to this meeting, but the whole idea of bringing a sanded epoxy surface back to beautiful translucency. You had said something about a certain grit and then a certain application over the surface afterwards. Could you share that with us?
Yeah, so we've got a couple of things going here. One is, Jenny, could you just go in the office and on top of that cabinet, one of those charcuterie boards, just like yours is in there. So one thing that'll happen if you do a tabletop type pour, and by tabletop, I mean, it's not necessarily a tabletop, it's a cutting board or a charcuterie board like Jenny's about to bring out. When you do that, the mechanics of that are going to be, you've got that board elevated. Thanks. You've got this board elevated off of your plastic, and I just use Dixie cups for that all the time. The reason I use Dixie cups, like painter's pyramids, would be fine, except that if we get a lot of overflow and we kind of flood the plastic, maybe that epoxy is going to stick to that painter's pyramid and that all is going to end up in the garbage. If I use inexpensive Dixie cups as my painter's pyramids and they get epoxy on them and go in the garbage, I don't care. So we do some kind of a pour. It comes over the edge. We work it over the edge and end up with these drips on the bottom. So in that regard, that sanding is going to happen on most tabletop products. That sanding is going to happen about 3 days out from the pour. That's when they're fully cured. And I just do that with a random orbit sander and start with either 60 or 80 grit, depending on how bad the drips are, and sand it back down to wood. And then I'm going to finish the bottom, the wood, however I would finish the top. The other way we can treat that is you can mask this off with masking tape. If that's the route you're going, you don't let it get to 3 days. You let it only go to somewhere between 16 and 24 hours. You got to test it. So this is the glue squeeze out approach of, if we let glue get to that rubbery point as it's squeezed out of a joint, maybe 15 minutes, 30 minutes after glue up, you can take a sharp glue chisel and slice that off the surface. Similarly here, if this has been masked off and the masking tape goes right to the edge, there'll be a point where we can come on the bottom, come after the bottom with a heat gun and maybe a razor knife. And with a little bit of heat hitting that epoxy, we'll be able to get that masking tape to peel, and that'll get us right back down to wood, just like masking off an edge when you're painting. But you do need to use the heat gun to manipulate to get that epoxy a little bit softened up. At this stage, 3 days out, you're not going to soften it up again. And that's where hitting that window to make sure the heat gun is going to have an effect is going to work. On the top, so Travis's other part of the question, to get this to look cool, if you do the tabletop correctly, when you're done with this, you're done. And correctly is the room is the right temperature. We do the pour. We manipulate this with a heat gun, even if we're not manipulating it. So by manipulated, I mean I'm using the heat gun like a brush to blow the gold into the white and move everything around. Even if we're not doing that, you're using a heat gun to take bubbles out of this surface. So if we do that correctly, and then this sits in an environment where we don't have dust, then it's going to look just like this. This finish we're looking at here is right off the pour. If you're doing a pour that's a crack in the middle of a wooden table, and we're going to see some of this, once that's cured out, most epoxy manufacturers recommend you don't sand that epoxy beyond 220, 221, whatever it takes. Little pop culture reference there. It's a great movie. You don't sand it beyond 220 because if you sand it too fine, when you finish everything, what you're going to do is in the finishing process is you're going to finish over the epoxy with the same product you're finishing over the wood. If you sand the epoxy too fine, the polyurethane or water-based lacquer or catalyzed lacquer or whatever your finish is, Odie's oil, isn't going to stick and it's going to slough off of that epoxy. And then you're going to have to take all the finish off and start over again. So again, that magic number, check with your manufacturer, but is typically 220 grit sandpaper is where you stop sanding that stuff that's embedded in the wooden surface. And then you just finish over everything in one fell swoop.
Okay. Thank you.
Question, Jenny?
Yes. Any VOCs associated with using epoxy?
So yes, and the general recommendation is a VOC mask or a well-ventilated room. None of these have a real strong smell to them. And in fact, I'm doing a cedar strip canoe, and we did, what did we put on that thing, Jenny? To do the outside took like a gallon, I think, of epoxy. So we did that. Jenny was here. We did that about a month ago. And in the shop, even with that volume of open air, 17-foot canoe covered with epoxy, there was not a real strong smell in here. Some products state that they're lower than others, and it's a good thing to look at. But you can't go wrong with either running an exhaust fan or wearing a VOC mask, but it's nowhere near as bad as like catalyzed lacquer or something like that. Nowhere near that stink and VOC level. All right, Ginny says we're caught up on questions. Let me do one more zap here. It just has to wake up each time. How about, do we sell when it hits 110? Is that the Bitcoin? Because that's where we're, oh, no, 120, 124. So this was, right now, this is at 124 degrees. And like I said, it's the last time I did this demo, we hit is either 180 or 185.
But George, what was it about the temperature that would damage the epoxy? Does the plastic break down? Is it the surrounding material that gets affected? I mean, what is it that you're so concerned about the high temperatures about?
Well, what'll happen is if I just leave this and then, I don't know, send you a picture tomorrow, when this gets hard, the surface will be all oogie. It won't be flat. It'll prevent it from leveling out.
Got it.
And the other thing I was going to say, since we're talking about tabletop there, one of the things I never got until I learned more was we're taking a sheet of plastic in the form of epoxy and we're pouring it over a tabletop like my friend Charlie did. That was a walnut slab that was 32 by 42. The tabletop products are designed with flexibility in them. So we know wood expands and contracts seasonally, and they're made to allow for that. So again, we're back to choosing the right product for the job, we need something that's not going to be just a sheet of polycarbonate firmly fastened to a piece of wood, because something's got to give.
Got it.
So yes, we have plastic, polycarbonate. I'm messing with words here. We're not pouring polycarbonate, but what I'm saying is with a tabletop epoxy, they've been designed to move with the material. So we're not ending up with just a rigid sheet of plastic laying over wood that wants to seasonally expand and contract. And that being said, just like any other finish, you have to also seal the bottom, which doesn't mean you have to epoxy the bottom, but you need to get something on the bottom of that table. It could be your everyday finish of shellac, lacquer, polyurethane, whatever it is, and then do the pour over the top. Yes, ma'am?
Going back to a previous question, could you sand to 5,000 grit and then buff it to get the shine back?
So can you sand and then buff it back out? So yes. So let's say we do this, and the theory is it should be done after the pour, but we do get dust mites, or you find, I don't know, some blemish here after the fact. So yeah, we can sand this and then treat it like, buffing a boat, buffing a car. I've had really good luck with Total Boats. Total Shine is the second product in the line, and I'm looking back there to see if I can see what the other one is. One is, there's two Total Boat products. The finishing one is Total Shine. And then there's another Total something that precedes that. It's rubbing compound. But yeah, you sand it fine. It's epoxy, so you can wet sand it, and then polish it after that and buff it out, and that'll get you back to this point where it's shiny, with having then removed the dust nibs or whatever it was, whatever reason got you to that point.
Great.
Okay, screen share.
Sounds good.
All right. Ginny is going to leave us. Thanks, Ginny, for running
Thank you,
the
Ginny.
camera. And we're even in the right spot. So we looked earlier at pigments, and here they are again. And one of the things I mentioned is that pigment gives us color, and it's a color. So you'll see by contrast in the next couple slides here what we get from mica powder. In this case, there's a low enough volume of pigment in this that it left it a little bit translucent. We don't have it completely opaque. Mica powder we have seen, and here's the result. Again, the mica powder gives us that pearlescence. This could very well be simply blue. Bye, Jenny. This could be just blue pigment over here. This is for sure mica powder. This is for sure mica powder, because you can see, like I said, I keep using that pearlescent word over and over again. But that's the difference that we get from those kind of things, but from the mica powder. Amazon sells all sorts of really cool metal flakes. This brass is just nothing but, it's brass powder. You can see it right there. And then there's some copper stuff. These are bigger flakes. And these can also be mixed in with these things. You want to mix these in late in the process, basically right before you're ready to pour, because they are heavy and they can settle out if you get them mixed in there too early. And then the result of something like that, these are cracks in a cherry table that I filled with blue epoxy. The blue epoxy has a little bit of that, it was called penny copper, that really orange flake in the previous slide. That's what's mixed into this stuff before the pour.
Hey, George, in the chain of events, and I'm going to pick up where Ginny left off in terms of asking questions from the chat room. In the chain of events from where you do the first mix and you stir for the length of your favorite song from the 70s.
Who are you?
What temperature does the epoxy have to reach before you pour, or can you just pour immediately after you've completed the mixing?
Well, so there's not a temperature gauge on the mixing. We're not using the exothermic reaction as a guide to pour. We're getting the shop to 70, 72, 75 degrees, mix it. And then what I do is I make sure the 2-part mix or 3-to-1 mix, whatever it is thoroughly mixed. Then I add color, then I add metal flake, then I pour. Does that speak to the question?
Great. It does. Thank you.
So this is an example, like I said, I'm not going to do probably ever in my life a river table, but here's this beautiful slab, a walnut, with these big voids in it. This big inclusion here, and then this is a big crack on the end. And so if you want to use that for a desktop or a tabletop, what do you got? Because you don't have a flat surface. You're not going to have a flat surface. And I sure don't want to fill that with Timbermate wood dough. So this is a great case of using epoxy in order to make this happen. So sequence of events: Tyvek tape, house wrap tape. Epoxy will not stick to that. It's a great thing to know. And what you need to do if you're going to make a dam, now we're on the bottom side of that same slab. These are pieces of MDF. They've been covered with Tyvek tape. And then in this step, the gasket that's going to hold this to the bottom of the table is silicone caulk. It's very important. This is 100% silicone. That is what works for this. So there's a bead of 100% silicone caulk all the way around the edge. It's already on this one. Then these are going to get flipped over here. And what we're doing is, from the front side, we're looking at the back side. Anything that looks remotely like a hole that epoxy could come through, you have to do this to. And it's amazing how, epoxy is a liquid. It's going to find. There we go. Are we back?
Yes, good. Okay, great.
Battery went out.
Sorry, yeah, my mic died, which I put new batteries in right when we started. So don't buy whatever brand of batteries these are. I'm sorry about that.
No problem. Glad you're back. That's fantastic.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. So where I was going with this was, if I'm looking to pour here, and on the bottom of the slab there's a hole way over here, I would still dam that other hole, because you just never know what might be connected inside here. So MDF, shrink wrap, or house wrap tape, 100% silicone as a gasket, and then those get flipped over and put in place on the bottom. There's another one in this case on the end, because we had that big crack on the end of the piece. The downside of this is just, you got to prep. if you're using silicone for this, that has to be allowed to dry overnight before we do the pour to make sure it's fully cured out. The other thing to look at here is this little berm. This crack and this hole were completely surrounded with, you can either use caulk again, or you can use hot glue. And the reason for that is when we have these big fissures in the wood, again, we don't know inside that chunk of walnut, where does this all end? This is whatever, Huck Finn or Tom Sawyer's cave, and who knows how far back it goes. So it's very easy to just say, I don't have this berm. If I pour to the level of the walnut and I babysit it for a little bit and then I walk away, maybe I come back the next day and it's below the level of the walnut, and I either have to do another pour or I have to sand all this wood down flush to the epoxy. If you do a berm around it like this, and again, with hot glue or silicone caulk, then you fill to the top of the berm. And it's buying you a significantly greater amount of volume so that the settling process doesn't get away from you and end up below the surface.
And George, you haven't said it, but it's implicit in what you're showing us, which is having a level workpiece is incredibly important.
Yeah, so in your setup here, poly on the table, I've got this blocked up off the table, and part of that is the dams are on the bottom of it. But you, especially on a relatively big pour like this has to be dead level left to right and end to end. Otherwise, when we pour this, we could be below the wood on one end and above the wood on the other, and it'll mess you up. It's a very important step.
Did you put penetrating epoxy in the sides there to perhaps?
I didn't penetrating epoxy. I didn't put penetrating on these because they just would have been so difficult to get at.
Got it.
So I kept a weather eye on this, and I hit it with a heat gun every once in a while. The deep pour stuff cures out so slowly that it's typically pretty easy to get this bubble free just by virtue of it stays liquid for so long that the bubbles come out of it.
Got it.
It is important, again, with this idea of it flowing into all these fissures. Penetrating epoxy is really, really watery. Deep pour epoxy is pretty watery. Tabletop epoxy is pretty thick. So you can mix and match mediums. If you had a case where you had dammed this from the bottom and maybe you were a little iffy on the dam you made, you could do a layer of tabletop that is only as thick as it's allowed to be. So somewhere between 1/8 and 1/4 inch thick. But because it's so much thicker inherently, it's less likely to bleed through a dam and it tacks up faster. So you could do a layer of tabletop on the bottom. Then when it gets to that right point where it's not cured out, it's a little bit sticky, then start with your more liquidy deep pours over the top of that to buy some insurance that you're not going to blow through or drip through your dam.
Got it.
And then this is the end result. So this, where we can see through, you're looking through absolutely clear epoxy here, and then that crack on the end, absolutely clear epoxy there. Under a coat of finish now at this point.
Very nice.
Another chunk of walnut, just fully these little spider web cracks. Now these are smaller cracks. They're not these huge fissures and holes we saw in the other one. So the other thing you can use for a dam is HVAC tape, aluminum tape. And again, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck, if it looks like a crack, if it looks like you could get a bleeder, tape is cheaper than epoxy. Cover that up and make sure that you've got it sealed. Once the tape goes on, just put the heel of your hand on that and press it, or use a J roller like you would use on plastic laminate. If you're going this route, so this slabs, you can see these marks in it running this way. This was leveled with a woodpecker router or a slab leveling jig. It was leveled with a router bit. It's not perfectly dead flat. It hasn't been sanded, but it's flat enough the tape is going to work. If this is still rough sawn from a bandsaw or a circ saw mill, that is not going to be flat enough to accept this tape. In that case, silicone caulk would do it because it's got gap filling capabilities, or level the slab first, which is what I would do, and then come back and do the epoxy work. There's no sense pouring a bunch of epoxy. If this is still rough sawn and it's going to end up smooth, why pour epoxy level with that rough sawn and then clean all that off later? You're just wasting epoxy. So the closer you are to finished dimension, the less epoxy you're going to cut off the top of this thing. And in this case, I had tinted that black, and that makes it, you'll see in a sec, that's going to make it blend in better with the surrounding instead of using a clear. And there it is. So each of these little spider webs, that's epoxy, that's epoxy, that's epoxy. And same deal, it takes the slab from where could I even use that for a project to, yes, I can, because now this is a flat surface and it looks kind of cool, I think.
It does.
This ended up being Ginny's desk. This is hard maple, absolutely beautiful piece, crazy with figure, but significant crack. And again, not from a functionality perspective, not good for a desk. And in addition to this, it's got all these little bark inclusions that look like that. Every one of those black dots is a hole. So resolution on this was damming the crack, same deal, house wrap tape, MDF dams, and then those got fixed to the bottom of this. You can see there was just a small crack on the end. I was able to take care of this one with HVAC tape. So once those were fixed in place, then because I screwed this one down, this maple surface was a little more irregular than the walnut we just looked at. So I ran screws through the MDF and then I caulked the edge of it. And instead of putting the silicone under it, because this was a more straight line, in order to make sure that I didn't get a leak. But again, 100% silicone caulk, just happens to be white instead of clear. And I could get away with the screws because it's the bottom of a desk. So nobody's ever going to see that.
Yep.
Then I used a syringe full of tabletop epoxy. And I constantly remind Ginny, it took me an hour and a half to fill every one of these little inclusions.
George, the good news is you proved to her that you love her.
Yes, apparently. I hope so. And then deep pour product in the end, you can see through it. There's the Tyvek tape there with slight over pours. And I wasn't going to berm every one of these inclusions. And I wasn't really concerned. It wasn't a setup like this where I was concerned that was going to continue to seep and end up below the surface. So this setup of just a slight overpour on those worked fine. And that's the finished product there. And there's that crack in the end.
Very nice.
This desk is at my sister's house. This is the sister slab to this one. So it had the same inclusions, but it didn't have the crack. And again, just an example of, in the absence of filling all of these with epoxy, I don't know what you would do to get this to be a level surface so that you could actually use it as a desk. This is Doug fir, beautiful stuff. Twofold gig here. This got cut into 28-inch long pieces for a shelf system. So what happened, cutting 28 inches here is fine. Cutting 28 over here, this crack is so big, this threatened to come apart. And you can really see here how intense that crack is. So something had to happen there to save this. And just as a side note, to keep the rustic look going with this thing, I cut these to length with an electric chainsaw instead of a circ saw or something. Whoops. So that they would have that rough sawn look on the end of them there. Tinted the epoxy blue. You can see not HVAC tape, but in this case, Tyvek tape on the bottom is what's damming those cracks so that it doesn't flow all the way through.
Quick
And
question
that
here
was,
was asked. Quick
what?
question, do you ever have problems with the epoxy joining the silicone berm and being difficult to remove?
It's a little bit of a pain to sand off. I start with a belt sander. I'm maybe one of the few woodworkers who still owns a belt sander. Belt sander with 80 grit, and you might go through a couple of belts quickly. The epoxy sands really well. It's the hot glue that can tend to, in the silicone caulk, can tend to jam it up. If there's silicone caulk on there, I do take a chisel first and I cut as much of the caulk off as I can. Hot glue, I don't bother with that because that sands okay. The silicone does tend to gum up the paper, but it's a necessary evil. If you've got a slab flattening mill, shop made or commercially made, you can throw these back on the mill and re-level this top, just kissing it to a point where you're taking the epoxy off. And that's more expeditious maybe than leaning over it with a sander, depending on just how much epoxy work you've done.
Right, okay, thank you.
And this is the end product of that blue epoxy in the Doug fir, and it's the end goal was this shelf, industrial looking shelf made with the 3/4 inch black pipe. These slabs are crazy cool, sequence cut, so they're book matched. This one had this huge void in it. There's a huge inclusion there. And then they both had a boatload of just tiny little cracks. So no huge surprise here. It's kind of second verse, same as the first. Closer look at the big crack. Did a clear pour on that big bark inclusion. It's dammed on the bottom. There's the berm that lets me do the over pour on the top. And then I put black in the smaller cracks, just like I did on that other chunk of walnut.
Hey, George, it wasn't an issue back when you were doing the clear, but when you moved to the black, there's a question about color bleeding out into the wood. Do you do any treatment on the edges or anything to prevent that from happening?
That could be a thing, and it's a good question. And that's another purpose penetrating epoxy serves, would be if you were concerned about that happening, then pre-treat the surrounding wood with penetrating epoxy. Here, where I'm putting dark in dark, if I get a bleed, I don't think it's going to be an issue, because it's the wood. What I'm simulating here is what these spots are going to look like when they're wet with finish anyway. So it's going to be okay. But when we get to the cribbage board, if I forget to circle back to this, remind me, and we'll circle back to it. But if the preemptive strike would be brush this with penetrating epoxy first,
Yeah.
and then that can't capillary out into the surrounding wood.
This is prompting a few other questions, if you don't mind. One is, once the epoxy is poured and cured, will the crack continue over time, or does there some sort of adhesion that comes along with the epoxy?
So this is a great question, and it's I think the same question for cutting in butterflies or bow ties. The wood should be, the wood needs to be dry when we do this. If the wood is, and dry is somewhere around 8% moisture content. If there's excessive moisture in there, when you pour epoxy, you're going to get a reaction, a real bad reaction. The moisture in the wood will ruin the epoxy. So if the wood is dry, if the wood is acclimated to your shop, and where I'm going with all this is, if the wood is stable, this piece has cracked to the extent that it's going to crack. My expectation here, and the same with a bow tie, is not that I'm gluing the wood together, or in the case of a bow tie, I'm mechanically holding it together. I'm putting the bow tie in because it looks cool. And it looks like I've stitched the crack together, but I have zero expectation that there's going to be any more wood movement. So same here, the wood at the point where we're using it in our shop, just like if we're building anything, should be to a point where, will there be a little bit more expansion and contraction seasonally? Yes. But I don't expect that. What's causing the cracks are different drying rates that are from different parts of the wood. The pith of the tree reacts way differently than the sapwood of the tree. And that's what makes cracks happen. So once we're stable, that shouldn't be a thing anymore.
Because this stuff is pretty expensive, do you have a good way of estimating the amount of volume you'd need to fill a void?
Really loud volume. Yes, so here's what you do. So let's go back, because that walnut is a good example. Well, this one too. What you do is you measure this, and what we're going after is cubic inches. And you're gonna have to spitball this a little bit. But in a shape like this, what I would do is say, all right, this is 16 inches long, and it's 0 wide down there, and it's whatever, 1.25 inches wide here. So if I measure it in about the middle, and it's 1 inch, then 1 inch wide times 1.5 inch thick times 16
Perfect.
is cubic inches, times 0.55 converts you to ounces. So the conversion, cubic inches to ounces, is multiplied times 0.55. Then I always overmix a little bit. Now there's an it depends there. If I'm pouring clear and I need more, there's a pretty good chance I can color match clear.
Yeah, right.
If I'm pouring blue, black is easy, but if I'm pouring blue, I want to have enough of that left, and we'll come back to like, what if I mix a boatload too much? We have an answer for that. But I want to do that calculation and then mix a little bit more than what I think I'm going to need, especially if I mix in color.
Excellent. Great.
And a lot of the manufacturers have calculators on their websites, but it's doing the same thing I just told you. The hard part is just if it's super irregular, how do we figure that out? And you just got to spitball it as best you can.
Excellent. Thank you.
So again, they were sequence cut slabs, so they're book matched. At this point, the epoxy work is done. They've been joined in the center, and that's that bark inclusion there. All the little black cracks all over the place, or all the little cracks all over the place, are now filled with black. And that is, I think that might still be raw walnut at that point. That is, this has got Osmos top oil on it, which is a really cool product. And that's the final table. So, again, second verse, same as the first. Beautiful pieces of walnut, crazy cool that they're sequence cut and book matched, but with these big holes in them, that ain't going to be my dining. I guess the good news is if you left that and you spilled milk, it would automatically gutter itself to the floor and you wouldn't have to clean it up. But from a practical perspective, you probably don't want that. So the epoxy let me use material here I wouldn't have otherwise been able to use. Charcuterie board. So now we'll just get into samples of a bunch of different stuff. We've talked about this mica powder, a little bit of that wave pattern going here. And I mentioned earlier, as a solvent, denatured alcohol, to make this happen, that's rubbing alcohol, the highest percentage you can get. So you can buy 70% alcohol. It'll work, but it's not going to work as effectively for this process. This process being where we're getting this all lacy looking like that. That's from spritzing this with 90 or 99%, whatever it was, isopropyl alcohol over the top of this. And that turns that white into that lace look.
And you're blowing as well, right?
Yeah, so sequence of events here is you put on your base colors, probably, I think I did a dark blue, a little bit lighter blue, and I hit this with a heat gun. And I get that kind of settled in. The edges were rounded over, 1/4 inch round over. So using a rubber glove, I'm encouraging, by just touching this with my finger and pulling the epoxy over the edge, I'm encouraging it to flow over the edge. Then when I heat gun the top of this, the white isn't on yet. When I heat gun the top of this, I'm using that as a blower to direct the epoxy and get it to flow. It's got a surface tension to it. So if I don't break that surface tension with my finger, it isn't necessarily prone to wanting to waterfall over this edge. So that's why I'm pulling my finger through. Once I've done that, then using the heat gun, it'll flow more naturally on its own. So I do that. The heat gun also takes the bubbles out of this blue and blue area. Then you pour a little bit of clear as a buffer zone, and then you pour the white oxide over the top of that, white mixed with epoxy over the top of that. Come back with the heat gun again to distribute that a little bit. And then the last step is hitting that with isopropyl alcohol in a spritz bottle, sorry. And that's what gives it that lace pattern.
Such a great effect.
It's very cool. It's fun. And it's
Do you have a particular-
all of this stuff, you know, you got to practice this stuff on a small scale, either just on scrap, or when Jess was here and we did this as a class, everybody did this treatment to 3 or 4 pieces of 10 by 10 plywood that were going in the dumpster before we did it on a real project.
Yeah.
It's like any skill set, you've got to practice it before you put it on your Mother's Day gift.
Yeah. Hey, George, 2 not directly related questions that you can answer briefly. Do you have a preference between silicone or hot glue for the berms? I think you said that the hot glue cleans up better, right?
Well, yeah, and hot glue, because I'm lazy and I probably don't anticipate very well. So it's bad enough that if I use silicone on the dams, I have to let that gasket sit overnight before I can pour. If I use silicone for the berm, now I have to let that sit.
Yeah.
And of course, hot glue, the second it cools off, it's done. It's ready to go. So generally for the berms, I'm using hot glue because then I've already waited a day to get to the top because of the dams on the bottom.
Got it. And is there a particular type of hot gun you use, or is it just a regular,
Regular standard gun.
Okay.
I do find, well, within the glues, when you grab those sticks, some of them are all like flexible, like a crummy hot dog. And some of them are really, really rigid sticks of hot glue. And I'm sure there's some official name for that. But the rigid ones cool, sand better than the really flexible ones. And I think at the end of the day, it's just a harder adhesive. And in the world of adhesives, it probably solves some other problem. But in the world of berms, I like the hard ones because then it sands out about the same way the epoxy does.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Cutting board, and this is just a cool thing to know, is IKEA sells cutting boards like this for less than I can buy material for. So to go to IKEA, buy a bunch of these really inexpensive cutting boards, do your epoxy treatment and or laser work or CNC work or whatever it is. If any of you are monetizing your woodworking hobby, I never claimed then that I made the board, but I'll take credit for this and I'll take credit for this. But they're nice boards and they are amazingly inexpensive. And it's a good way to move product through your shop quickly by doing what you're best at, doing this kind of stuff, rather than necessarily making every cutting board.
Good to know.
So here's that cribbage board, but my zoom thing is behind. Let's see if I can. See that? Is that showing up?
Yeah, the bleeding.
Yeah, so this is elm. And that's the color from that's the blue I mixed into this is leaching into the end grain. So of course it does it there, but then it doesn't do it there because that's long grain. And then it's not really an issue there because that's clear and white. So what I should have preemptively put penetrating epoxy on this before I put before I filled it.
Good example, yeah.
So same deal, CNC project and a recess in the center. I'm not, as I said earlier, I'm not at all artistic, but I can pull off a wave with epoxy. So it's just a cool way to add something. The person that got this really loves the beach. So kind of a sand colored wood with the wave in the middle, blah, 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 blah. All right, now casting. So this is a pressure pot, and you can solve this problem, and I'll talk about the problem in a sec, with a pressure pot or a vacuum pot. So what can happen as we're casting stuff, this is different than, we're not filling cracks on a table, we're making blanks we're going to make a knife handle out of, or turn on the lathe, or whatever that is, that we can get microscopic air bubbles in there that we don't know are in there until we go back and do the turning or the knife handle or whatever it is. If you put that casting in a pressure pot or a vacuum pot, in the case of a pressure pot, we get this to about 45 PSI. It puts all of the contents, including the epoxy, under pressure. And what happens there, the physics is interesting. There are still bubbles in there, but the pressure has made the bubbles so small, you can't see them anymore. So this is an insurance policy that then when we get that blank out, we're bubble free. Now, a vacuum pot can do the same thing, and it's a different approach. With a vacuum pot, we're reducing atmospheric pressure. Water boils at 212 degrees because atmospheric pressure at sea level is what it is. And when there's less atmospheric pressure at the top of a mountain, water boils at a lower temp. So same thing. If we vacuum all the air out of a vacuum chamber, we can boil, quotation marks in the air, the bubbles out of that epoxy and get the bubbles to come out. The reason I primarily stick with the pressure pot is when I teach this stuff, probably every one of us has an air compressor. I don't know that every one of us has a vacuum pump.
Right.
So this as a solution to the problem is an easier nut to crack than the vacuum pot. And it works great. I mean, there's nothing wrong with doing this. And this is not sold as a epoxy vacuum pot. This is a paint pot. So in its real life, air still comes in, but this led to a siphon tube that went down into here. Then there's an output tube over here. So when we fill this with paint and then pressurize it, and you have a gun attached to it, when you squeeze the trigger on the gun, the air in the tank is pushing the paint through the siphon tube out the gun. So that's what it's really for.
Got it. Hey, George, there was somebody who has a question that apparently I didn't represent correctly. They have a problem with a ceramic heat gun dropping ceramic dust in their epoxy. That's why he was asking earlier about whether there was a specific type of heat gun or
heat gun.
Better.
Now, I'm using a Wagner. Oh shoot, it's like a DuraBlow or something like that. It's there's nothing crazy special about it. It's a Wagner heat gun. But it's never blown particles on me like that.
Okay, hopefully that helps Scott.
Silicone molds readily available on Amazon. These are going to come into play when either you want to make a sphere, so that one's intact. That's a sphere mold, also split in two, same as that one does. Before I said you want to overmix your epoxy, and then we'll come up with solutions for if I have stuff left over at the end. Now, what do I do? Here's one example of that. These are coasters. So when you have epoxy left at the end of a pour, you have your coaster molds handy, and then you can just dump that in there and you end up with coasters to give away at Christmas time. In this case, those are arrow fletchings. A number of people I know, including myself, shoot traditional archery. So for a while I was mass producing these clear coasters with arrow fletching in them.
Hey, George, just going back to the spheres, how do you actually fill those things to the top?
There's a little tiny belly button right there. There's a hole right there.
And you use a syringe?
No, if I haven't drunk too much coffee, I'll free pour that. If you put I pretty commonly transfer the epoxy from the mix cup to a Dixie cup. And then with that paper Dixie cup, you can fold it with your fingers and put one distinct V-shaped pour spout on it. And from there, it's pretty easy to hit that.
Got it.
In the world of molds, the other thing I do is pretty much anything that looks like a container in my house gets saved. So Dixie cups, we've talked about that kind of ad nauseum. Vitamin bottles, yogurt thing, protein powder thing. This is a piece of Tupperware. This is a bowl from Walmart. These bowls, I think it's next slide too. Nope. I went to Walmart looking for something I could cast bowl blanks in. These bowls are silicone and they're sold for 50 cents. So I bought, I don't know, 2 or 3 or 4 of them, not sure if the epoxy would separate from them or not, and figured for 50 cents, if it sticks, the first step in turning the bowl will be turning this off the outside of the epoxy. But in the end, it just pops right out of there. So I've used them over and over and over again. This one I haven't tried yet. What I'm really trying to figure out here is if I fill this with $100 worth of epoxy, what I'd like to do is fill it with $60 worth of epoxy, push something in the center where it's going to get hollowed out anyway, and not fill this entire thing and then go hollow a bowl out. So I haven't cracked that nut yet, but it's here to get used also as a epoxy mold. But that's cream cheese container. So then again, when I have epoxy left at the end of a pour and I've got this stuff laying around, these I tucked pine cones into and then poured over the top of them. Here I had turned brass on my lathe. I turned a chunk of brass, saved all the shavings. So it's a downside to my woodworking now is I'm constantly looking at like, ooh, should I save that? Ooh, should I save that? So these were brass shavings from that project. And then I just shoved them into the Dixie cups and poured epoxy over the top. And then these are, especially these two, are just the right size for the wine bottle stoppers, to turn the head of a wine bottle stopper.
Oh, yeah.
This thing is filled with just little chunks of wood that were left over from something. Pack them in there, poured the excess epoxy over, and then this one's also got pine cones in it.
Cool.
So again, a variety of molds. Now, the other way to go with molds is you can make them. So we'll see examples of the direction I went with this. If you use melamine or high molecular weight plastic, you don't have to use the house wrap tape. If you're making your mold out of MDF or plywood and you don't want it to be destructive at the end, you don't want the epoxy to stick to it, then put the tape on prior to assembly is the easiest way to do that. Don't try to tape the interior of a box you build. It's easiest to put the tape on and then put the box together. But again, with melamine and with high molecular weight plastic, you don't have to do that because it won't stick. Once you have your box in any form, plastic or melamine or house wrap tape MDF, you have to silicone these corners. And don't, he says from experience, think that if I put enough screws in there and draw that tight, there's no way epoxy is going to get through there. Yes, it will. And this leaking inside of your pressure pot is a really bad day. So you have to silicone caulk those inside corners to prevent this box from leaking. Then, as we've talked about, give that silicone the opportunity to dry before you cast whatever it is you're doing.
Right.
So a thing to remember is wood floats, and it also floats in epoxy. So you have to make, this is a chunk of a burl in the middle surrounded by a pour. And then I just put these outriggers on it. So there was a little bit more to hold on to, and masking tape over the top like this is plenty, but you have to make some accommodation to hold this down so that this wood doesn't just float to the top of the epoxy. And then you don't, I mean, you'll still have a casting, it'll just be weird, but you won't have this epoxy embedded in the, or you won't have the wood embedded in the epoxy when you're done, because it'll have floated up out of there.
Yeah.
So this is a cast bowl in those Walmart bowls, obviously a red mixed epoxy with some chunks of maple embedded in it. No meaning to the pattern, just, I don't know, just got shoved in there. So this one was sanded to about 600 grit. And then the last step was that total boat, total shine product went on there. And that's how it got the gloss it has now.
Nice shine.
Yeah, came out really nice. This was I had all these rips from some project. I had all these 3/4 by 3/4 rips in hickory, oak, walnut, maple, cherry. So I stood at the bandsaw and kind of cut them into cubes and then put them in the Walmart bowl, put something over the top so they wouldn't float out. This is a silver mica powder, kind of a pewter colored mica powder. The photo doesn't do it great justice here, but created a neat contrast against the wood chunks. This bowl was this is a great example of penetrating epoxy's usefulness. Friend of mine's family owns a cabin. They were getting ready to sell. At some point, Dad had cut a tree down at the cabin. The tree was still on the ground. Dad had long since died, birch tree. This bowl came out of a crotch from that birch tree, but it was more air than wood. But this was like the last vestige of Dad for this family at the cabin. You get it, these heirloom pieces. Yeah. So this is epoxy, this is epoxy, this is epoxy, this is epoxy, this is epoxy. So this is, again, a great case. Epoxy is a problem solver where had I not done that, there's no, I've turned some pretty dicey stuff in my life. There's no way I could have turned this bowl and expected it to stay intact without having put epoxy into all of these punky spots to get it to stick together.
Yeah.
This is the bullet bowl. So a bunch of
George, you forgot to say famous bullet.
This is the famous bullet bowl. Bunch of empty, I never remember what they're called, cartridges, casings, whatever they are. They went into the Walmart bowl and then got covered with epoxy. And then I just put it on the lathe and turned it. And I didn't touch the outside. That's right off the pour. That's what it looked like. But then the inside, this is slightly hollowed. And that's why you're looking on the bias across some of these tubes, is because of the way that concave comes down and back up. You can really see it right there. Yeah. Interesting, probably, I was stewing one night and I says to myself, I've turned epoxy on the lathe, I've turned brass on the lathe. Could I not put brass and epoxy and make a bullet bowl? And this was the result. So, very slow turning process. This is, we can do extra points if you can guess what this is. It's a wine bottle stopper, but the stuff in the epoxy here looks nothing like its original form.
Is this the brass shavings you showed us previously?
Nope. These are pine cones in here. But by the time you cut into them and you're kind of coming across on the bias across the pine cone, you're looking at weird parts of it. So these are chunks that I cast in order to make whatever, you could cut them into turning blanks. For me, it's more likely a knife handle. We'll see some of that. But these would have gone into the MDF mold wrapped in Tyvek tape or the melamine mold or whatever. But all of this stuff, all of these things go, not that big guy, these things go in the pressure pot when I'm casting them to make sure that I don't have bubbles in them. So chunks of wood surrounded by epoxy, and then it gives me this kind of a look. This is madrone. And then that reddish tint epoxy there, and then another piece of madrone, which is this blank right here. That knife handle was cut off at this end of that pour. So again, it's, for me, it's a way that I've made 11 billion knife handles just out of wood, which is great. But it just gives it a whole different look, and that I really like.
It's great.
these mosaic pins are crazy cool. Nothing to do with epoxy, but knife supply places sell these, and it's a brass tube into which they have stuffed a bunch of other pieces. And that's what creates these different patterns inside it. It's really, really neat. Same deal, dagger. This is a piece of ash burl with a blue epoxy cast next to it. And that's the last one.
That looks great. And as you hit that last one, I'm realizing you've been exposing to us all along in the lower right-hand corner how much past your bedtime it is.
Yeah. That's all right. I love getting up at 4:30 after being up till midnight. No, it's
Hey,
fine.
George,
I knew, I mean, it's West Coast. What are you going to do? So.
Right. Thank you so much for doing this. Say, we've had the questions come in over the course of time, so I don't think that we need to take any time out for additional Q&A, but could you tell us a little bit more about the book that you are going to be publishing soon?
Yeah, so a bunch of the stuff that you saw here, the shelves, the walnut dining table, I don't know, other stuff. Part of the drive, part of the reason those are there is I just last Wednesday submitted the manuscript for a book. Working title is Building with Live Edge Slabs. So 12 chapters, 5 of them are technique based. And for example, it's how to create a waterfall edge is a chapter. Prepping the slab is a chapter. Working with epoxy and slabs is a chapter. So 5 are technique based, and then the other 7 are project based. So with the 7 projects, some of that calls on what you learn from the 5 technique chapters, plus it introduces other new stuff. So the 7 projects are the sequence cut slabs and the book match, so how do we do that? So that was one of them. I don't know. And then there's 6 others. Charcuterie boards. The charcuterie board we saw here is one of the chapters. A waterfall, another waterfall table. I can actually show you because it's sitting right there.
Oh, yeah.
That's a piece of birch that was, the tree is from my friend's place. And then I cut the tree on my sawmill here. So it's waterfalled on that end, and then it's a steel leg, which is hiding behind that chunk of wood there, but a steel leg on the other end. So that was another one of the projects. So yeah, it's Fox Chapel is the publisher, and the published date at this point is scheduled for November. It's on Amazon right now. If you just Google Vondriska, my last name, I think Vondriska Live Edge is going to get you there. And it's available for pre-sale now for, I think, $21.99 or something like that. So
I will, as a follow-on to this, send out to everybody a link to that because it's so relevant to what we have here. I also just want you to know what's being said that you can't see, but appreciation from people. Paul says, great stuff. Lou says, thank you, great presentation. Mark says, George always gives a great presentation. Thanks. We do appreciate what you do here, and thank you very much. If I could make just a small plug for the people who are here, we will, as a follow-on to this, be offering an epoxy class at the shop. It'll be April 12 and 13. It's not yet available for signing up, but I just wanted you to know that George has set the stage for us to bring some of this into what we do, and Mike McElney, with all of his experience with epoxy, will be teaching that class. Anybody have any last minute questions for George before we allow him to crawl between the covers and call it a day? No, it sounds like we're pretty much at the end here. George, fantastic. Thank you very, very much.
Well, thanks again for hosting and having me. And despite the time difference, we can do this anytime. You guys you're a great group and a very dynamic group. So glad we got it to work out.
Appreciate that, George. Good night. Good night, everybody.
Thank you, George.
Thank you, George.
Thank you.
George.
Good night.
Good night.
Night.